Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 340. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the morning of Saturday, December the 2nd, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County. This week, we had 4 icons pass away. And when I say icons, I mean people who changed history and people who made their mark on history for a long, long time. Rosalind Carter, Sandra Day O'Connor, Henry Kissinger, Charlie Munger. Now, in the case of Kissinger, he was 100 years old. Munger, he was just a few weeks shy of 100 years old. Charlie Munger, by the way, for those of you who don't know, he was kind of out of the spotlight. Most everybody knows his guy. He was the right-hand man of Berkshire Hathaway's Warren Buffett. Okay, so you couldn't use Warren Buffett in a sentence without using Charlie Munger as well. But he was a few weeks shy of 100. Kissinger was 100. Rosalind Carter was darn near 100. Sandra Day O'Connor, I guess she was just a mere child at 93. But all helped change the world. Now, some will say, well, Rosalind Carter didn't. She was just First Lady. Friends, if you don't think that the wife of the president influences his policy, you're quite naive. Okay, so all 4 of these people helped shape the world in which we live today. You can credit them, you can blame them, but they certainly all played a part. Of those 4, however, the most influential and to me the most interesting was Henry Kissinger. And today's biography is about Henry Kissinger, some of the things that he did and actually was still doing just until very recently. I mean, he wasn't a 100-year-old guy living in a nursing home. I mean, just a few weeks ago, he went to China and visited with Xi Jinping, the president of China, premier, whatever they call him, dictator. So he was very active up until the very end. So that's the subject of today's podcast. Henry Kissinger, the guy who basically shaped diplomacy as we know it today. Before we do that, I want to get into what led up to this podcast, okay? And Kissinger, when Kissinger passed away, I thought, you know what, with the way I've been doing things and some of the things that are in the news, I have to do a podcast on Kissinger. Every winter, as many of you know, I do a whole lot more reading in the winter than the summer because in the summertime, I do stuff outside like we all do. I spend time in the pool. I spend time hiking, biking, et cetera, et cetera. Wintertime, it's dark by 5 o'clock. And right now, as I'm doing the podcast, it's approaching 7 o'clock in the morning and the sun isn't even starting to come up. So it's dark and dreary and cold and ugly. So I do a whole lot more reading. Last winter, I read many books on the biographies of the golden era Hollywood stars, Frank Sinatra, Sophia Loren, Cary Grant, et cetera, those types of stars, okay? I'm gone back to biographies, but I didn't want to do Hollywood people because I started doing some more of those and I was done with it, okay? I had started a book on Orson Welles and it was just too cumbersome. So I started looking into other historical figures who had nothing to do with Hollywood. I've read books on Calamity Jane in the Old West, Big Nose Kate, who was the mistress of Doc Holliday for many years. I just finished a book on Oscar Wilde. I'm now reading a book on Napoleon. Now, I started the book on Napoleon for an interesting reason, and that was I saw the movie, the Ridley Scott movie starring, what's his face? The Joker. Yeah, Joaquin Phoenix, that guy. But I had seen the trailers for this movie for months and I've wanted to see it for a long time. So the trophy wife and I saw it on Sunday. And to say that I was disappointed is being kind. It was, I'm not going to say it was awful. It was 2.5 hours long, which is a long time for a movie for me. And of that 2.5 hours, there was probably a half an hour that I enjoyed. The rest of it was a lot of it was silly soap opera, which I have no tolerance for that kind of stuff at all. The diplomacy, the history, the war scenes, those were all done very well. But like I said, if you watch a 2.5 hour movie and you enjoyed a half an hour of it, okay. But it is what it is. But Napoleon the man has always, what I want to say, he's interested me, okay? And I've always been enamored with captains of industry, world leaders, power brokers, people who actually changed or are changing the lives we have now. Napoleon did that. In fact, as I was researching the podcast on Kissinger, part of Kissinger's diplomacy, the way he went about diplomacy, had to do with a certain individual who I'll mention in the podcast, but that individual based his worldviews on Napoleon and how he approached things. So perhaps I'll do a podcast on Napoleon later, but I wanted to do one on Kissinger, who indirectly used the ways of Napoleon Bonaparte with his diplomacy. Before that, before I get into the podcast, there's one thing going on in the news, and I love doing this because people always say, what's your podcast about? I say, well, news of the day that maybe you're not aware of. Now, certainly everybody's aware of Henry Kissinger, but news of the day that people aren't aware of. I'm not going to do things on the Israeli-Hamas war, the Ukraine, stuff like that, the stuff that's in the news all the time. Not that it's not important, because it is, but everybody is beating that to death. There's something going on today. Actually, it will come to a head perhaps as soon as tomorrow or early next week, that has made zero impact in the news, but has potential to have more impact on our country than the war in Israel or the war in Ukraine combined. And it's the war in South America, the potential war in South America. Have you heard this story? Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, who took over for Chavez after he died. Basically, his country's broke, and Chavez and Maduro have basically ruined one of the, if not the most prosperous country in Latin America, with some of the world's largest oil reserves. They turned it into a socialist communist dictatorship, and they've ruined the country. What fueled Venezuela? Oil. They still have plenty of oil. But you know who else has oil? The country of Guyana, who's right next to Venezuela. All of a sudden, they found oil in Guyana. And Guyana, you probably haven't heard much about it because it's a very poor country, not much going on, and then they found oil. Lots of oil. And basically, you've heard of company towns. Guyana is basically a company country ran by ExxonMobil, and not in a bad way, because sure, they're having some problems with the environment, which you're going to have if you pump oil. But this has trickled down to the people, and the people of Guyana have all of a sudden many of them become very prosperous. Others have become somewhat prosperous, and they have wealth, money, stuff that they never had before. And Maduro can't stand it. Sunday, Venezuelans are going to the polls, and they will be asked to answer an unusually provocative question. Should the government of Venezuela be given a blank check to invade Guyana and wrestle away 3/4 of its territory? You say, what? I've not heard of this. I know. I don't know why you haven't, but you should have. I've been reading about this all week. Apparently, there's been a dispute for a long time between Guyana and Venezuela, but of whose territory belongs to whom. Guyana says 3/4 of their country belongs to them. Venezuela says, no, it's ours. But nobody cared because Venezuela had plenty of money and oil, and Guyana had nothing. So why would you want to take territory from somebody who has nothing, and this territory is basically worthless jungle? Well, now it's full of oil, and Venezuela wants it. And on Sunday, they're actually going to have a vote that says, hey, Can we have a blank check to invade this country and take it over? Now you think to yourself, well, the Venezuelan people aren't stupid and they're going to vote not to do this. I agree. The Venezuelan people are not stupid, and I do not believe they would ever vote to do something like that. But what you've got to remember is Maduro is the president who was elected. Ha ha ha. If you think a fair election can happen in Venezuela, you obviously believe in Santa Claus, because that's not going to happen. The election is going to go the way Maduro wants it to go. And there's a real good chance that by sometime next week, Venezuela is going to be invading Guyana. Friends, if that happens, there's a little thing called the Monroe Doctrine, okay? And the Monroe Doctrine says that if something's going on in Latin America and we don't like it, we can intervene militarily. So if Maduro decides to invade Guyana, legally, the United States can invade Venezuela. Friends, that can be a big deal. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Okay, enough on that. Let's go ahead and go with the podcast for today. Henry Kissinger. He was so influential. In fact, he died. That's according to a statement posted on his website and brought up by his consulting firm. That's right. His wife didn't announce this. His children didn't announce this. His company announced this. Yes, he still ran a company, Kissinger Consulting, and he started this company in 1982 and was still running the company, not just kind of as a figurehead. He was pulling the strings and running the show. He died Wednesday at his home quietly. He was 100 years old. He was a German-born academic and was the only American official to ever concurrently serve as Secretary of State and the White House National Security Advisor. And he did it for 8 straight years. That's why Kissinger was so influential. I mean, today, people stay in these posts for 1, 2, 3 years tops, okay? And you have different people as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Kissinger was both for 8 years under 2 different presidents, Nixon and Ford. And that gave him immense power during those administrations. Now, that helped him end the war in Vietnam, the U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam, and helped shape American foreign policy towards the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. In fact, under Kissinger, there was a term that was coined that everybody has heard: the New World Order. That was Henry Kissinger. And I will also say that my opinion of the New World Order has changed over the years. Once upon a time, I hated it. It's the Trilateral Commission. It's the Bilderbergers. It's the all those, the captains of industry pulling all the strings and making us just dance, okay? But what Kissinger diplomacy, New World Order, etc., what that has done is that allowed the United States to stay insulated from the mess and grow very strong. You can say that's a good thing. You can say that's a bad thing, but you can't deny that's a thing. Because we were insulated from all this, this country was able to grow even stronger. And today we are absolutely the strongest country in the world. The strongest country in the world is the one that pulls the strings, the one that rules the roost, the one that controls things. And as I've said many, many times before, for those of you who say, well, the United States shouldn't be dictating foreign policy on other countries, shouldn't be running the show, I remind you that somebody's going to be running the show. And if you look at the world powers today, do you want it to be the United States, China, or Russia? Those are your 3 choices nowadays. Okay, so pick your poison. Let's continue. Kissinger's diplomatic corps made him a war hero to war-weary Americans, because I remember this because he stopped the Vietnam War. You can say what you will about Nixon and Kissinger, but the Vietnam War basically went on my whole life and then ended in the 70s as far as the United States was concerned. We finally got out of that mess, okay? And Kissinger did it, okay? Now, after that, it was nuclear Armageddon. In fact, the Soviets have more bombs than we do. We have more bombs than the Soviets. We have enough bombs to blow each other up 15 times. And people were scared of that, okay? Still are, still should be. But Kissinger drew the ire of both the American left, which held him responsible for brutalities committed abroad, and the right, which regarded him with suspicion for advocating détente with communist regimes. In other words, the New World Order. Let's all get along so we don't kill each other. Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973, along with Vietnamese leader, here's a name out of the past, Lee Duc-Tho. Remember them? And they both won the Nobel Peace Prize for pursuing secret diplomatic talks that forged the Paris Peace Accords, and it ended the U.S. military campaign in Southeast Asia. Now, Kissinger won gratitude for helping the U.S. get out of the war in Vietnam. In 1974, he was featured as a diplomatic Superman on the cover of Newsweek, and clad in tights, a cape, and a Super K on his chest. When's the last time Newsweek magazine or any mainstream publication gave any credit, had any Republican anything held in honor on the cover of their magazine? Different day, different times. Check this out, though. And just to tell you who were fans of Kissinger, this doesn't happen anymore. Quote, Kissinger literally wrote the book on diplomacy. He gave us the vocabulary of modern diplomacy, the very words shuttle diplomacy and strategic patience. Who said that? John Kerry, who was Secretary of State back in 2014. Kerry was, he was a Democrat, okay? When's the last time you heard a Democrat saying anything good about a Republican, or a Republican saying anything good about a Democrat? That's how much Kissinger was at least respected by everybody. In half a century, Kissinger never lost his love for the public spotlight or global politicking. He parlayed his contacts to foreign government and global business leaders into a lucrative consulting firm, Kissinger Associates. He established that in 1982, 41 years ago. He's been running that company for 41 years, okay? He also maintained an ambitious writing career well into his 90s, publishing books on history, strategic policy, and his own diplomatic activities. In 2022, okay, this was last year, he wrote a book called Leadership, 6 Studies in World Strategy, in which he profiled post-World War II leaders whom he called visionaries. Among his lasting achievements was overseeing the Nixon administration's clandestine outreach in the early 70s to the People's Republic of China, resulting in the restoration of full diplomatic relationships between Washington and Beijing. Because if you remember, there were the two Chinas, mainland China and the Republic of China on Taiwan. And we recognized Taiwan as the true China. We flipped that in the 70s, and there was a big time pushback because of that, okay? Now, the successful execution of the China card was credited with helping to tip the global balance against the Soviet Union and accelerating Beijing's integration into the international economy. China and Russia were very much cohorts. And when the world embraced China, when China got involved into the world economy, they gravitated away from the Soviet Union, and that was a big deal. And that was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union, because they had no other allies. I should say no other allies with any power. No Western European countries had anything to do with them. China stopped having anything to do with them. So what did they have? Okay, sure, the satellite states who basically depended on them. They didn't offer anything in the positive. So Russia was left alone in the world, and there began the decline. Okay. Now, China's leader Xi Jinping sent condolences to President Biden, while Chinese officials and news outlets eulogized Kissinger as an old friend who had gone on to visit China more than 100 times in his lifetime. 100 times he had been to China, more than 100, okay? Kissinger was extraordinarily generous with his wisdom and his advice. Again, words of another Democrat, current Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. He said that Thursday while he was visiting Israel. Quote, few people were better students of history. Even fewer people did more to shape history than Henry Kissinger. True, true, and true. Again, because you were National Security Advisor and Secretary of State for 8 years under 2 presidents. He got a lot done. What else did Kissinger do? Well, he negotiated an end to the 1973 Yom Kippur War that was sparked by Egypt and Syria's joint attacks on Israel. Now, he and other U.S. officials worried that the conflict could escalate into the first direct military conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Why? Because Damascus and Cairo, the capitals of Syria and Egypt, got their weapons from the Soviet Union, and they were big-time Soviet allies. Kissinger then turned Israel into not an ally, but at least they were tolerant of Israel, okay? And that caused the Soviet Union to lose a lot of their power there too. In fact, for Kissinger's 8 years in government service, which ran from 1969 to 1977, Gerald Ford awarded Kissinger the Presidential Medal of Freedom. What else did he do? Well, Kissinger was a practitioner of a form of international statecraft called realpolitik. And his critics said it placed the goal of balancing the interests of the world powers above the pursuits of democracy and human rights. And they're not wrong. While facing criticism at times for pursuing détente with the Soviets, Kissinger also oversaw fierce anti-communist campaigns in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So again, both the right and the left criticized Kissinger, but he didn't back down because of the criticism. He kind of doubled down, okay? So you say, okay, well, Kissinger just he got in bed with the communist Chinese. He pacified the Russians, okay? So he was obviously a lefty pinko, right? Well, he also supported military coups against democratically elected governments in Chile and Argentina in the 1970s. Fearful their politicians were growing too close to Moscow. In other words, Chile and Argentina freely elected governments. Chile was Salvador Allende, and basically dictators took them over. Augusto Pinochet, basically they shot the president in the head. Pinochet took over as a military dictatorship, and that was at the very least supported, at the very most influenced by the United States, by Henry Kissinger, okay? Kissinger tactfully supported Indonesia's military invasion in 1975 of East Timor. That was a former Portuguese colony in Asia, spooked by fears that its freely elected government was tilting towards communism. In other words, if he saw somebody in the third world going communist, he put his foot down. At the same time, trying to placate the Soviets and the Chinese. Now, human rights campaigners long argued that Kissinger should have been charged with war crimes for his role in overseeing the Nixon administration's secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos during the height of the Vietnam War. I remember that. And the American military operations killed thousands of Cambodians and Laotians. And experts on the U.S. on the Southeast Asia, they estimate that inadvertently this helped bring the radical Khmer Rouge to power in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Now, Kissinger was born in 1923 in Germany. He was a German Jew who immigrated to the United States in 1938 when they saw the Nazi Party beginning to pick up power. Some reports say he was a Holocaust survivor. No, he wasn't, okay? Now, the Holocaust was beginning in Germany. His family saw the handwriting on the wall and emigrated, but he was not a Holocaust survivor per se. They moved from Germany to Upper Manhattan, the Washington Heights neighborhood. Kissinger was drafted in the Army at age 20 in 1943 and saw combat in France and Germany. He was a private in the 84th Infantry Division. After the war, He used the GI Bill and studied and taught political science at Harvard University, earning his PhD. Now, Kissinger's escape from Germany greatly shaped his scholarship and statecraft. In fact, the diplomatic and academic placed on the pursuit of global stability above ideological goals. He saw what happened in Germany. He thought, okay, this can't happen again, so I believe this, so I'm going to do that. That's what I mean by saying that, okay? Much of Kissinger's work at Harvard focused on studying the statesmanship of European strategist Clement von Metternich and Robert Shaw. Robert Shaw was the Viscount of Castlereagh. Now, Metternich was renowned for his diplomatic efforts to redraw Europe's borders following the demise of Napoleon Bonaparte. That's where Napoleon comes into Kissinger. Okay, for those of you who don't know history or foggy with history, basically, under Napoleon Bonaparte, France basically ruled Europe, okay, for about 12 years. His armies were amazing. He used cannon fire and cavalry to decimate and humiliate everyone he faced up until the end when he got too big for his britches, like happens to all dictators, okay? But basically, Napoleon ruled Europe. But after the fall of Napoleon, somebody had to break up Europe, okay? And that's who this Clemens von Metternich studied, okay? How this was done. In other words, how do you take a mess and break it up so that we can have a peaceful world? Kissinger looked at that, okay? In fact, Kissinger used his platform at Harvard to transition into Washington political circles. Now, how did he do this? He became friends with somebody who was very influential, Nelson Rockefeller. Now, he was a Republican politician. I think he was governor of New York. He was vice president of the United States, and his last name is Rockefeller. He had more money than God. Now, Kissinger advised Rockefeller unsuccessfully during his runs for presidency. Now, after Nixon became president in 1969, Nixon, through Rockefeller, asked Kissinger to serve as his national security advisor and then Secretary of State. Now, Nixon and Kissinger, they were an odd power couple in the White House. In fact, they were so odd that they complemented each other. Nixon he didn't like the public. He was nervous in front of the public. He didn't like the press. But Kissinger, he loved it. So Nixon let Kissinger be his front man. I hate it. You love it. You work for me. You want to do it? Go ahead. And he did. And Kissinger reveled in his celebrity status, was known for one-liners and quick wit. In fact, he was a funny guy. And he maintained that thick German accent throughout his whole life, which made his one-liners that much funnier. It's been said that Kissinger had more wisecracks to his name than most professional comedians. Here's a couple of them. On domestic politics, Kissinger involved that, quote, 90% of politicians give the other 10% a bad reputation, which isn't wrong. On overconfidence, Kissinger said, to be absolutely certain about something, one must know everything or nothing about it. In other words, you're either an expert or a fool. On decision-making, Kissinger said, each success only buys an admission ticket to a more difficult problem. True that. On gender relations, Kissinger said, nobody will ever win the battle of the sexes. There's just too much fraternizing with the enemy, which once again, very true. If you remember, those of you old enough to remember Henry Kissinger in the 70s, he was a divorcee during most of his service in the Nixon White House, and he was a regular on the Georgetown cocktail circuit, at times appearing with Hollywood starlets on his arm. He once famously called himself a secret swinger and told a reporter that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. Now, some romps in the limelight prompted blowback. In fact, in 1972, he had an interview with an Italian journalist, Oriana Fallaci, and he called his interest in women a mere sideline that didn't interfere with his work. Quote, for me, Women are only a diversion, a hobby, he said, and nobody spends too much time with his hobbies. Friends, if he had said that today, he'd have been canceled. But 1972 was a different day and different time. It was 51 years ago. Nixon was enraged by the interview, first published by an Italian magazine and later reprinted in a U.S. publication, in which Kissinger compared himself to a lone cowboy, appearing to take credit for running the U.S. foreign policy. And actually, he kind of did. Quote, Americans, this is what Kissinger said, Americans like the cowboy who leads the wagon train by riding ahead and alone on his horse. The cowboy who rides all alone into town, the village, with his horse and nothing else. Nixon lost his mind, okay, thinking that Kissinger was being the guy who's taking credit for everything. But the fact was, he kind of was doing everything. Now, was he taking Nixon's policy and following it through? Certainly. But he followed it through, and he followed it through successfully. Now, in his memoirs, Kissinger wrote that Falassi, the Italian journalist, had likely put some words in his mouth with some skillful editing. He called the interview without a doubt the single most disastrous conversation I've ever had with any member of the press, and agreed that the interview was largely out of vanity. Translation, Kissinger had gotten too big for his britches, and he knew it, okay? So he didn't apologize, but he backed it off a little bit. Now, friends of Kissinger said his image as a ladies' man was in fact just a front. Why? Well, after his divorce from his first wife in 1964, he was in a carefully hidden long-term relationship with a woman who eventually became his second wife, Nancy Maginnis. Now, Kissinger's two children were still young at the time of his divorce, so he wanted to keep the relationship out of the press until shortly before his second marriage, 10 years later. Who does that nowadays? You know what? Sure, I got divorced from mama, but for the sake of the children, I'm going to go ahead and keep my love life low-key, perhaps divert away from what's really going on for the sake of the children. Celebrities don't do that nowadays, and Kissinger was certainly a celebrity. Now, Nixon and Kissinger shared a fondness for secrecy and viewed the battle with the Soviet Union as a global chess match. Nixon's historic 1972 summit with China's communist leader Mao Zedong was brokered by Kissinger during 2 secret visits to Beijing in the preceding months. How did he do it, you ask? We threw off the scent of foreign intelligence services in the media by getting to China via Pakistan. So he flew to Pakistan and then went to China aboard a Pakistani military aircraft, and the press never knew he was going there. I don't know that could happen today. First of all, I think all diplomats are too much pompous asses to fly on a Pakistani military aircraft. Second of all, somebody would leak it somewhere, okay? But Kissinger continued to advise White House and Congress well into his 90s, but remarked later in life that he didn't know if his brand of diplomacy could survive in the digital age. The advent of mobile phones, digital cameras, social media limits the ability to maintain the secrecy required for major diplomatic breakthroughs, Kissinger said, which, in other words, nothing's done under the covers. Nothing's done under the media's. Everybody knows everything about everyone always, okay? No more secrecy. In fact, Kissinger worried that the internet was having a corrosive effect on the popular intellect, and the modernity was a poor incubator for insightful leaders. Reading a complex book carefully and engaging it let's start over, because I'm reading this quotation by Kissinger. Reading a complex book carefully and engaging with it critically has become a counterculture act, as was memorized. Has become. Let's start this one more time, dummy. Okay, I'm trying to read this quote, and I'm thinking of Kissinger with his thick German accent. Kissinger said, "Reading a complex book carefully engaging it with being critical has become as countercultural of an act as memorizing an epic poem in the earlier print-based age. In other words, when Gutenberg first had the printing press, you could now see these great poems and you could memorize them. Not many people did that, and it was difficult. And that's really a profound statement. Unfortunately, I had to read it 3 times before I got it out. Kissinger said that China represents a monumental challenge for the U.S. because the U.S. has never had to face a competitor of equal might and resources. The Soviet Union was not. The Soviet Union was, and actually still is, and has always been for the last, 200 years, at best a second world country, perhaps a third world country with enough bombs to destroy the world 8 times over, okay? Maybe 80 times over, okay? That's the only thing that makes the Soviet Union and the current Russia a threat, is their military. Other than that, they're not an economic power. They're just not a player, except for they've got a lot of weapons and a really big army, okay? How big is that army? How influential are they? Well, they can't take over a country that's 1/8 the size of them population-wise, Ukraine. They can't do it. So that tells you something about the Soviet Union. China, different story altogether. Here's the thing about China that most people don't realize. Even when it comes to China's economy, it's not as big as ours yet. But China has 4 times the people as the United States. 4 times. That's a lot, friends. That's a lot. So they are certainly a competitor. Worrying about the deepening chill in relationships between Washington and Beijing, he told the Wall Street Journal last year that the U.S. needs to refrain from being heedlessly adversarial towards Beijing and pursue dialogue instead. Kissinger to the end. Let's talk before we act. In fact, Chinese leaders actually gave a warm reception in Beijing when Kissinger last visited China. When? July of 2023. Yeah, he was 100 years old, and he held meetings with Xi Jinping and other Chinese top diplomats. He was 100, okay? Now, after Russia's invasion of the Ukraine last year, Kissinger sounded warnings about the need to make peace with Russia, regardless of the differences over fundamental values. In fact, check this out. I remember when this happened, and at first I was taken aback, but if you think about it, Kissinger was right. Kissinger said it was a mistake for the West to dangle before Ukraine the possibility of joining NATO, arguing that it would provoke Moscow, and it certainly did. But, he said, Russia's invasion made it incumbent for the West to help defend Ukraine and, after negotiated peace, treat it as a member of the alliance. Translation: all the countries that bordered the Soviet Union, most all, were not part of NATO. They were neutral. They were like a buffer between NATO and the old Soviet Union, the current Russia. When we dangled the NATO carrot in front of Ukraine, Ukraine started to grab at it, Russia took offense, and that's why they invaded Ukraine, okay? We're at the edge of war with Russia and China on issues we partially created without any concept of how this was going to end or what it's supposed to lead to. He told the Wall Street Journal that last year. Now, if you think about that and be honest, Kissinger was right. So many people, especially the Fox News crowd, which once upon a time I loved Fox News. I can't watch it anymore. And don't take this wrong, but the main people who go crazy over this kind of stuff are the right-wingers, the far-right people who never, about 3 times in a paragraph, refer to themselves as patriots, okay? Well, the United States is the greatest country in the world. It is. But we're the greatest country in the world. We should do things our way. If you don't like it, you should go to Moscow. Okay? That's ridiculous. You've got to get along. Okay? If you got to call yourself a patriot 3 times in a paragraph, I will just say you're not much of a patriot. You're just a chest beater, okay? But that's another story for another day, and that should be another podcast for another time. Also, Kissinger said after Hamas attack on Israel last month, so even last month he was still commenting on this stuff. Kissinger said Israel had to impose a penalty in response and that a quick ceasefire was impossible. Peace talks are not going to, are not conceivable to me, Kissinger said, because if terrorists can appear openly and take hostages and kill people, you're not going to have peace. Now, asked how Kissinger felt about the Palestinian supporters claiming that Hamas's attack on the streets of Berlin were fine. They distributed sweets during this to try to convince people. Kissinger said he bore no grievance against the German people, but he said they had let too many foreigners into their country. And this is one of the last profound things that Kissinger ever said, and he's not wrong. He said it was a grave mistake to let in so many people of totally different cultures and religions and concepts because it creates a pressure group inside each country that does that. Now, he's talking about Germany. I'm going to end this podcast on a very positive note. When Kissinger made that statement, he was right when referring to Germany. In other words, Germany's full of Germans. France is full of French. UK is full of English. And so on and so forth. The United States is full of Americans. But Americans are Germans, English, Irish, Italians, Nigerians, Chinese, Laotians, Japanese, Venezuelans, Mexicans, Canadians, on and on and on. America is the only true melting pot in the world, and we have problems getting along. But we're the only country who has taken in so many people and so many cultures and still wound up on top. That's pretty incredible. So that's it. Henry Kissinger, dead at 100 years of age. Henry Kissinger, R.I.P. Well, that's it. I'm done. That's the podcast. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. Send me your email. Send me your emails. I'd love to go ahead and correspond with you if you agree or disagree with this podcast. JamesStrongShow@hotmail.com. Please share the podcast with your friends and say, hey, listen to this dope. He's not half bad. That's it. Until next time, this is James Strong saying adios.